Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm Katerina Pasadomo. I'm an associate professor here in Southern Studies and Anthropology. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jessica Taylor. Jessica Taylor is an assistant professor, not for long, in the history department at Virginia Tech. As a public historian, she collaborates on projects across the Southeast as diverse as oral histories with boatbuilders, augmented reality tours of historic sites, and reconstructed maps of precolonial landscapes. Her current work connects graduate and undergraduate students to history firsthand through fieldwork experiences in oral history and an ongoing project documenting escape attempts of indentured servants and enslaved people in the 17th-century Chesapeake. Dr. Taylor received a PhD in early American history from the University of Florida in 2017, and her book, which is available for purchase right outside here, is called Plain Paths and Dividing Lines, Navigating Native Land and Water in the 17th-Century Chesapeake. It was published just last month by the University of Virginia Press, and it is available as an open access ebook, which demonstrates, I think, her commitment to public history. So her talk today will draw on this project and is entitled Running Away from Early America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Taylor.
Thank you all so much for being here. I have to say I've never been more warmly welcomed, like anywhere ever. This has just been a really awesome time. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of things. The first, I'm just going to briefly introduce the book, which sort of frames the ongoing public history project we have going on. And then if there's a little bit of time, I'll read to you the story of my favorite escape attempt, which happened in Christmas of 1670, and involves all kinds of different people that I feature in the book. But I also want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a public and an oral historian first. So that means that I speak with the public, I speak with average people about their lives, and I record it. And a big part of that work happens in the place that I also study when it comes to the 17th century, which is Eastern Virginia. And in the public space in Eastern Virginia, which is really considered the root of a lot of our contemporary problems today, around racial violence, around the legacies of slavery, the legacies of indigenous removal. The story of all of these things is hotly contested. But one of the beautiful things that I come across in talking with people one-on-one inside of their homes is how well people who work the water, who farm, who work off of the shores in Eastern Virginia know the place. They know hundreds of miles of coastline, and it'll be 2 or 3 or 4 people who know that because they have lived there their entire lives. And that's how I really came to understand that 17th century to 21st century history is very locally constructed, and these really big issues that we deal with are also dealt with on a very local and personal level. The other thing that I do is work with archaeologists to document oral histories that they can then use to understand how landscapes were used historically. So I'll talk to a very old gentleman who remembers a time period before machinery, before running water, before irrigation, at the level that we have it now. And that'll help archaeologists understand what areas were farmed and when and why. But what that allows me to see is archaeologists see things very differently than historians. They see things as deposited in layers. And so I've worked with them in the field where they dig 2 inches down and there's a VHS tape. And then they dig down another couple inches and there's something from World War II, and then there's Civil War buttons, and then there's Revolutionary War buttons, and then at the very bottom is always indigenous history. It is the foundation for everything. And that is exactly what my book examines. It takes the idea, it takes a a very like deep history approach to this that says that if this is native land first, if the foundation for Commonwealth history, Commonwealth of Virginia history, Southeastern history is fundamentally indigenous, what is the interaction that those colonial artifacts, those colonial people are having with indigenous land and indigenous people? And my argument, which will feed into the project later, is that ultimately native threats to colonialism and non-elite threats to colonialism have always been intertwined. The kinds of threats that enslaved people pose to enslavers and the kind of threats that indigenous people pose to enslavers have always been interconnected. Native history makes it so that we can see how ultimately colonialism created by being founded on native land and being reliant on enslaved labor created a large degree of instability. So a big reason for that is that native power continued to exist. And how many of you all remember hearing about Jamestown and Pocahontas? Yeah? Okay. So that's 1614, and by the end of that decade, Pocahontas is no longer alive. How many of you all remember hearing about the attacks of 1622 and 1644 on Jamestown? Did that happen? I see some nods, okay. And Bacon's Rebellion. Does anyone remember anything about Virginia and Native people past that? No, right? But Virginian Native people actually, first of all, own land in the Commonwealth of Virginia, have reservations, but also continue to be a political force today. And this goes back to the 17th century. And for the colonizers' projects, that affects them in a few key ways. These are some quotes where elites are actually telling you the ways in which Native people and non-elite people are threatening to them. And they're very upfront about this. But the first way is that Native people continue to control intelligence and knowledge of the entire Chesapeake in a lot of those same ways that I'm talking about local people controlling and sort of understanding on a deeper level knowledge of the waterways today. And that allows them to maintain power disproportionate to their numbers because they control intelligence networks that go into the interior, but they have a better sense, and colonial elites knew this at the time, of where runaway enslaved people ended up, where indentured servants ended up, and also where other enemies, so for example, indigenous people who wish harm to the English, even other European powers might be within the Chesapeake. And so that in itself is a threat, obviously, to English people that don't really understand the landscape in which they ended up. But it also allows other people, English people included, to capitalize on that fear. So in this first quote here, a very wealthy man named William Claiborne, who wants to attack indigenous people, is actually trying to stir up fear among the English to go get them to preemptively attack, because he's arguing that indigenous people are going to attack the English before the English attack them. The other way is that because of the plantation system that relied on slavery, indigenous people were removed from their land, and Native people and their presence was actually what English people targeted. So they would see that Native people had a house, for example, or a village site, and they would say that land is already cleared, that land is already good, I'll take that. But that essentially allows a lot of those networks between those village and house sites to continue to exist. So what ends up happening is, first of all, English people spread out farther than they can possibly defend, which creates a lot of unnecessary expense trying to fortify those settlements. But it also leaves people open to further attack, and it leaves people proximate to native settlements in which indentured servants and enslaved people can run away. And that becomes a problem throughout the 17th century. And the last way is that it feeds long-term instability, when those expenses become too much, when attacks are not being stopped by hostile indigenous people, you get things like Bacon's Rebellion, which was entirely the fault of colonial elites, basically, but then turned the entire social structure in Virginia on its head for 2 years. So the really great thing to remember about this is that even though Bacon's Rebellion destroyed a lot of indigenous lives, many people were enslaved, murdered, and lots of their properties were taken, the really amazing thing is that indigenous people continue to work on the waterways and then into the interior. This is another project that we're working on right now called the Eastern Siouan Mapping Project that attempts to show the ways in which indigenous people in the Commonwealth of Virginia's bounds today were connected far into the interior. And when I show my students this, I ask them to point out things that they know. One of the biggest things you might recognize, because I think it comes down this far south, is 81. Was actually an indigenous road before colonization. And then, they point out different towns and they say, wait, I call that Roanoke now. Roanoke was a large indigenous town before it was Roanoke, Virginia, one of the larger towns in the Appalachian Mountains today. So these are the kinds of networks that English people in the 17th century were only dimly aware of when they first started to map out their own property lines, their own county lines, but also just trying to document native settlements in the 17th century. And this is John Smith's map. It was, at the time, and it still is used as one of the most accurate maps by an English person. But functionally, it really only charts the James and parts of the York River to a little bit past the fall line, and the other stuff beyond that is conjectural. He never really visited much past those spots. So what we end up seeing is the reality of the situation is that the James and York Rivers might have been controlled by the English, but they're actually claiming and settling way past that. So maps like this are really only expressions of desire. They're sort of an attempt to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where indigenous settlements are replaced by English ones eventually, right? That's their idea. But the reality is this, and this is these larger dots, or the smaller dots are the Powhatan indigenous peoples' attempts to destroy English settlements within their domains. But you can literally see how English people created plantations directly inside of Powhatan districts, partially in order to, the plan became supplant them. So the overall landscape, and this is probably one of the more accurate ones, this is a Dutch merchant's map, looks like this. So the English overall cling to the waterways, just like Native people most often live within a 2-minute walk of water during the 16th and 17th centuries, while the interior, for the most part, which again English people claimed was largely unknown and within indigenous control. And even inside of English settlements, indigenous people continued to live there. And indeed were relied on for things like food and intelligence of what was going on in places like you can see North Carolina, for example, here. So that leads me to my second project. So the Native history piece is this first half of it, and I wanted to document runaway attempts to escape bonded labor in the 17th century as the other half of this kind of threat. And I had this idea way back almost 10 years ago that what I wanted to do was document all of the escape attempts in the 17th century that I could. And I started a little database, and then I had to like finish grad school and get a job and forgot it. And then I realized that as more and more of these data sets started to show up, that this could actually be something really, really cool. So when we think about running away from bonded labor, there are a couple of problematic things that come to people's minds. Can anyone think, what comes to mind for most people when they think about running away from slavery? Instant death. And getting caught, yes. Yeah.
The wilderness.
The wilderness.
Navigating, like, unknown territory.
Yes, yes.
New places, new people. We are gonna meet new people.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, yes. The other thing that I would add to that is, so it's harrowing, it's dangerous, it's deadly, it's being in the wilderness, isolated and alone. It is also, people bring up the Underground Railroad, which is also like a very white-centered way to think about running away. Putting like a kind of person, like a Quaker or something in North Carolina at the center of the story of people trying to self-emancipate. The reality in the 17th century, and probably across the board, but the reality in the 17th century defies all of these things. And the thing that I really love about this project is because of court testimony, we get as close as we can to people really talking about what they want for their lives, talking about why they ran away, talking about where they were going. But we also get a sense of the really amazing strategy and networks that they're pulling on to get there. This is one of my favorite quotes from a gentleman who had seen someone else run away, had been testifying in someone else's trial, someone who had run away and gotten caught. And from that, he got the idea to run away with a different set of strategies than the first one. So he's learning from someone else's mistakes. And he says he has a book to learn to speak the Indian tongue. He also, it's not in here, has a bolt of cloth with him. Why might those be helpful? A book to learn to speak the Indian tongue and a bolt of cloth. Disguise, interesting. Trading, yes. Indigenous people during this time period traded in cloth, yes. And he wants to learn how to talk their language. What is the implication there? Like, why does he need to trade with an indigenous person?
He sees them as allies.
Yeah, exactly. He's trying to basically make new friends in order to escape to a different colony. And from the end of this, we can also see that he just wants to go to another place so that he can live better. And he's also, even though he is a white man, he's an indentured servant, he's evoking the language of slavery and presumably of race this early on in 1638. So there's a lot of really amazing things that come out of these testimonies. The first is the idea of, where am I going to make home? The most spectacular one was someone who said that they were going to Venice. They stole a boat and they were headed to Venice. I'm almost glad they got caught because I don't know that they would have made it in a canoe or a rowboat. But where did he get the idea for Venice? I have no idea, but that's amazing. Also, people making new friends. The amazing thing about servitude during this time period, and you know, this applies at other times in other places, is that it's not just English people. There are Dutch people, French people. At this point, Irish people oftentimes don't speak English, and even actually some Scottish people do not speak English either. And they're all trying to kind of create these networks that will help them, first of all, better their own lives, and as an extension of that, escape for freedom. And so oftentimes we actually get people that are quite young. Indentured servants could be like barely kindergarten age, for example. If you can get on the ship and come over, you can be indentured. So oftentimes quite young people are running to Native American towns in order to escape harsh treatment on a plantation. And also new politics. So I'm going to talk a little about this, but runaway laws are changing the ways in which people are coming together to run away, but they're also changing how people try to find alliances. So we get oftentimes African people coming together with, for example, Scottish or Dutch people in order to try to escape together, so much so that the law actually changes so that penalties are higher if that happens, therefore creating a racial divide inside of a class of people. And then also changing the way that people are thinking about how Native people should continue to live in an area if they consistently create a threat to the plantation economy by sheltering indigenous people. It's put in treaties with indigenous people that they're supposed to return runaways, for example, or they're supposed to go out and help catch runaways, because these are the people that know these places better than anyone else, including the elites that are running these plantations. And there are also the people where and if you're non-elite, you're thinking they might be on my side. So the collection of them together inside of a Native American town poses a threat. Just to give you a sense of the kind of work we've been doing, this is one such runaway person who we believe is indigenous because of the name and because of the master or enslaver. His name was William Claiborne from the previous slide, who was a trader with indigenous people. He was accused of not so much running away as disappearing. He was trading for his enslaver who lived at the very bottom of that map at a place called Kecoughtan. Now it's like Norfolk, Newport News area. And while he was on his way north to a trading post, which is kind of in Maryland territory there at Kent Island, he was stopped by an elite family that lived on the other shore at the Littleton property, who said, "Hey, can you take some stuff up for me too?" And he did, even though that was not part of the deal. And so all of a sudden, he just kind of disappears. And the fight happens, the court case happens not between Constantine and his enslaver, but between Claiborne and the Littletons, trying to figure out where this person went, basically for probably his own benefit, probably for his own profit. So this is a really interesting kind of runaway case that demonstrates the kind of mobility that people who were in bondage had at the time, but also shows us the spectrum. It's not what you would expect at all if you were thinking about the Underground Railroad and the wilderness, for example. These are well-connected people who are very much part of the colonial enterprise, even as they're trying to escape for their own advantage, even temporarily. So just to give you a little bit of background, I was concerned that just because we have a broad range of folks, that people wouldn't necessarily know how the 17th century labor system worked. It was a very broad range of people, and increasingly we're understanding that there were people who were not enslaved, but not under contract either. So there are indentured servants. Those are people that sign a contract or are kind of given a contract once they get here, if they're quite young, for example, who serve a set number of years in exchange for room and board, and then passage, but also we say corn and clothes, like a barrel of corn and a suit of clothes when they are set free. There are people who are brought to the colonies as enslaved people, or are enslaved upon arriving in the colony, especially indigenous people. It's estimated that about 50,000 indigenous people over the course of the 17th century were enslaved. But there are also tenants, people who are sort of under the thumb of elites, but are not in bondage per se. And then there are people that it's not really clear what their status is, and that causes a lot of problems as well. And I can speak more to that if people are interested. They also represent a broad range of people. There are people who have skills. Both enslaved people and indentured people came in with a wide variety of skills if they are adults. They could be political dissidents, they could be just quite poor, a lot of children, as I mentioned, particularly women and children, if they are captured and are sold into slavery as indigenous people, people who have been sailors in the past, all kinds of people. There's all of these overlapping, really interesting skill sets. And they get here in a wide variety of ways as well. So during the Virginia Company period, people are brought over to help construct the colony literally and work in tobacco. After that becomes very important. But the headright system is what really kicks this off. So you, as an elite person, are granted 50 acres of land for every person that you bring in. So all of a sudden you have people importing dozens and dozens of people and laying claim to tens of thousands of acres of land. And that actually helps the wealthy become wealthier. We also have Angolans starting in 1619, and then that increases obviously over the course of the 17th century with the Royal African Company. While the number of indentured servants does increase over the course of the 17th century, it starts to become less of a proportion compared to enslaved Africans at the end of the 17th century, early 18th century. And then over the course of time, indigenous slavery continues until it is made illegal, at the end of the 17th century. The reality, though, as I sort of indicated, is that people could end up in indentured servitude or slavery or something in between in ways that don't match those trajectories. So one of the more famous cases, and this is apocryphal, but this middle one here, someone tried to sell their wife essentially as an indentured servant in lieu of divorce. It became a funny little pamphlet that people with very dark humor in the 17th century sold. We do get people who were never given a contract. So they were told that maybe they were indentured, they're servants. When does it end? And in the case of, there's a gentleman named Philip Gowan on the Eastern Shore, his enslaver, Anthony Johnson. Has anyone heard that name? Anthony Johnson? Huh? No, this is 17th century, so yeah, Eastern Shore though. So Anthony Johnson was an African man who had a servant named Philip Gowan. He argued that Philip Gowan was enslaved. Philip Gowan was also an African, and the court agreed with him. Philip Gowan said, "I was never enslaved." And because of that court case, all of a sudden this guy's enslaved. So these are the kinds of things that happen in the 17th century that you don't really see later as slavery becomes very, very closely tied to race. They also have awesome skills that allow them to escape in ways that would surprise you. So one of the things that we are seeing a lot is that people have been escaping by boat. It makes sense in the Chesapeake, but it doesn't make sense when we are coming at it from a very narrow perspective about what we think running away is. And one kind of spectacular instance, a woman with a small child and a couple of friends stole a large boat and made it across the Chesapeake Bay to someone else's plantation. That kind of thing is incredible, and it's very well documented, but it shows us kind of the outer limits of what is possible during this time period. And they do get to know the place well, and so it doesn't really feel like a wilderness. It doesn't feel like death is instant in cases like this. So we started this project just this past couple of months. It's an NEH funded planning grant to look at 3 counties in the Northern Neck and part of the Middle Peninsula to document all of the escape attempts that we can from court records. And that is what we're working on now. We're excited about it for a couple of reasons. The first is that we hope that we can foreground women and children in a way that oftentimes does not happen in later accounts of people trying to run away. And that's oftentimes one of the invisible things that happens mentally for people is when they think about someone running away, they usually think about a single man. And that, first of all, is often not the case, but also there, and we can talk a little bit about this, is that there's a lot of labor that goes into an escape attempt on the part of women that are left behind. So women, for example, make beer, make cheese, make the kinds of cloth, or have the kinds of cloth that you would need for a sail, for example. All of those kinds of things sort of go undocumented unless someone is caught. And then we start to see a woman in the background who's also blamed for the attempt. We also think that we can start to see some patterns related to race and law. So if the punishments become worse in 1661, do we see an uptick in people taking their bonded laborer to court for running away for 3 or 4 days, for example? Will we see a decline in the number of Africans who are brought to court as they have fewer and fewer rights to begin with? And I think we can also provide some really cool geospatial data, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So briefly, the law related to runaways, and I should say runaways in quotes, we say escape bonded laborers at this point, but they are called runaway laws. Those are really tied to race in really interesting ways. Is anyone familiar with the John Punch case? Okay, so John Punch is the first person who was enslaved as punishment for a crime. And that is crucial for understanding the intersection between crime and punishment and race, broadly defined in U.S. history. So John Punch escaped with a man of Dutch descent and a man of Scottish descent. He was black. Those other 2 men, who are white, were given additional time and I think whipped, and he was enslaved for life. So that's considered to be one of the earliest moments that ties slavery to race, again, as punishment for a crime. Later on, we see people being assigned additional time. So if you escape for 60 days, you work an additional 120 days if you're indentured. In the 1660s, we get racialized punishments for running away. So you're punished more if you run away with a black man than if you do by yourself. And we get people getting engaged in policing in ways that they would not have in England. So adding huge bounties. It was a 2,000 pound of tobacco bounty on people in 1669. And then in 1705, there's a huge sweeping suite of acts that closely ties people of African descent, non-Christians, to slavery, and that includes in the extensions to the runaway laws. So how we've been doing this is really tied to a lot of other amazing projects that are happening at the same time. I'm sure if any of you guys teach or have been in a history class, you might have used the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, or Freedom on the Move is another really big one. These are huge data sets that have been created over the course of decades, documenting, for example, every boat that had brought over enslaved people, documenting every runaway ad in the 18th and 19th centuries. Those are ones that you have probably seen before, and we want our data to be interoperable with theirs, so you can kind of compare what goes on in the 18th century and what goes on in the 17th century and see how it looks. At the same time, and this is something that I would love to get feedback on, we run into a lot of challenges. So Virginia has major problems with records, and we have what are called burned counties. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Does anyone have to deal with that? So that, and during the Civil War, some things happened in Virginia, and a lot of courthouses were burned, and a lot of the records were burned. And even actually, so some of the records were actually brought to Richmond, which then, as you know, it didn't turn out well for Richmond. and at the end of the Civil War. So we're actually missing a huge amount of data, particularly for Virginia and North Carolina, which has also had, for example, like flooding issues and things like that. So the extent to which we can be certain of our numbers. And in fact, I'm sure that we're missing, entire revolts, for example, that are mentioned in the laws that were passed in the 17th century, but we don't have the court records for anymore. The extent we can be sure of the numbers is questionable. And also a lot of the records have just been really well loved, like a good old book, and they're sort of illegible. And even if we could read them, a lot of people who would help us transcribe them cannot. So those are the kinds of really basic issues that we have. In addition to court record organization, so the way that a court record works in the 17th century is they just, whoever shows up, they kind of go in order. So the story of Humphrey, a native servant accused by a planter of running away for 8 months, is buried underneath some people fighting about land. Probably there's a fornication case at the top. All of these kinds of things are buried inside of a single page. And then the most interesting thing is people who defy categorization, people we just don't know about. And that's sort of the exciting part of this. So currently, we have it set up where this is the kind of data that we are collecting right now based on our most detailed cases. So our detailed cases are usually ones where we have a lot of people that are involved in the same case, and it's terrifying and difficult for planters to figure out. So they're taking testimony from a lot of different people. So it's pages and pages and pages of testimony. We want to see how people are escaping. So are they escaping on foot? Are they escaping by boat? We want to see how they are punished. Is it corporal punishment? Is it time added? And at what point does that maybe start to shift? We also want to see how successful they were. Some people escape for 3 days. Some people escape for 2 years. There's a huge difference there, and maybe we can judge success according to all of these other factors. Are they escaping with other people? So we have ones where it's the same guy, he runs away once a week. He finally gets taken to court because he runs away once a week. At other sources, we have 3 or 4 guys, they steal a boat, they make it all the way to the Dutch colonies. So those are the kinds of things that I actually think that probably having other people would make you more successful, and I think so far it seems that I'm right about that. Are they convicted? Most people are convicted, but in a couple of cases they are not, which is really interesting. The biggest issues that we have right now are about gender and race or origin. A lot of people are not identified by either, and we don't want to assume race or gender if we aren't totally sure. So that's something that our team is working through right now, and I'd be interested to hear what you think. We also want to see if policing is involved, if a sheriff or constable was involved, if someone was paid a bounty to go get a person or hired to go get a person, if there were any additional costs to the enslavers. So one of the wealthiest guys in Virginia, 10 of his servants escaped. He spent a ton of money to ultimately successfully get them back, and then in taking them to court was able to pass on that cost to them through additional time. And then the role in the event, so we're also documenting court members whose own bonded laborers are running away. So we can see that they're basically, they're part of a system that's rewarding enslavers for catching their own bonded laborers. And then related cases. So if we have a case where someone is repeatedly abusing physically people in bondage to them, and then 2 years later, those same people run away, it's good to know. It's good to know that there was an abuse case directly before that. But the question is, can we consistently document that? So that's another problem area that we have. Lastly, we're also working on geospatial data. Currently we have a group of students that are working on a wide variety of really cool history projects kind of all together in the same room and talk out these issues together. And Hannah here with Arthur Rogers, who's an undergrad working with her. Hannah's a grad student in early America. She has been working to document the case of Thomas Wood, who is famous. He was a young boy who was caught and beaten so much repeatedly that he died. And it became a major case on the Eastern Shore in 1640. And so she's been looking to figure out who was sheltering him, why, how he found where he was being sheltered, especially as a young child, and the lengths to which he was going in order to get away from where he was. And she's doing that by looking at 17th century land patent records to see how these houses are and how these people that are giving testimony are related to one another spatially. She thinks now that he was actually probably swimming to this island off the coast of the Eastern Shore. So part of what inspired us is this really cool servant plot that was discovered in 1671, took place in 1670. 10 people tried to escape, but were ultimately caught because a storm came up and it was no longer safe for them to escape by boat. They were the ones that made the plan to move to Venice together. They said, I will go to Venice and there we will live. But it would not have been possible without two other factors. So most of the people that were trying to escape were men. But there were 4 or 5 women who gathered 14 cheeses, which I'm imagining is like, like those big blocks of cheese, huge numbers of loaves of bread. One of them gave them her red petticoat, which in the 17th century is what you have your period in, to use as a sail. And a lot of the men whittled oars by themselves. They left them in different locations in the woods. But when it finally came time to get out, just as they were leaving, a storm came in and they were blown to shore. And someone told on them, and they were ultimately caught. But the second thing that came out of this that's really interesting is they were depending on a pilot who I've never been able to find by the name of Black James, who was evidently either enslaved or bonded to the estate of a Dutch person who was going to be their pilot to escape out of the Chesapeake Bay to Europe. And it's a really cool story that we're still trying to figure out. Ultimately, though, our goal is to expand the project to North Carolina and Maryland, because a lot of these people actually made it to North Carolina and Maryland. And we hope we can track basically across now state lines people that were among the most successful and see how they tried to reinvent themselves in these other colonies. And that's me, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you so much.